Hello and welcome to day 2 of the Greenstyle Sundial Sew Along. And I'm so glad that you've joined me, and today we get to start sewing. Yesterday you should have cut out everything you need to start today. If you haven't yet, then go back and look at that video. So today we have just some simple steps. We will be sewing the front rise and the back rise. As well, if you have decided to do the gusset in this pattern, then I will have one section showing all of the steps for today using a gusset, and then I'll also have one section showing all of the steps for today without using it. So make sure you jump around to whichever view that you're doing. So if you're curious of whether or not that you should do the gusset, think about the gusset giving you just extra range of motion and extra movement. It doesn't put so much pressure on those 4 seams coming together under your crotch. So it gives you that capability. If you just plan to use your leggings for lounging or going on walks or doing, I would say, lighter type of activities, then you're probably not really going to notice much of a difference with the gusset. The gusset's not going to change the fit of the pattern, it just changes that range of motion. So if you're doing something that's very acrobatic or something with lots of squats and legs apart, you might find that you like it more having it in there. So anyways, without much more, let's go ahead and get in today. Let's start sewing. Okay, so when you cut your fabric out, you want to fold it along the green line, and so that you're cutting 2 mirror images. And so you can see on the bottom of this, there is another layer that they're mirror images of each other. And this one I am doing the gusset. So there is this extra piece right here. And if you want to do the gusset option, you'll want to either cut this off, or I still have it there, and then I just fold it back so that I have the option on future tights to choose the gusset or not the gusset. So since I'm doing the gusset on this one, I folded this back, and that is all I need for my legs. And now I'm going to cut out my gusset. Now that I have cut out 2 of the gussets like this, I'm just going to put the wrong side of them together, and I am going to baste all along these edges just so that I can treat them as one piece for the next step. And in order to baste, you're just going to put your sewing machine at the longest stitch possible on your straight stitch. It's usually between like 4.5 and 5. And you're just going to do just a stitch right here, and we can remove that stitch later. It's just to hold these in place together. So this is what it looks like basted. You can see I use kind of a maroon colored thread. Now you're going to just get one of your leg pieces. It doesn't matter which one, just pick which one, and you're going to lay it with the right side facing up like this, and you're going to find the back part. So the back part is going to have a much deeper curve than the front. The front should be much shallower. So you'll find your back, and you're going to take this and you're going to lay it, this gusset piece, and you're going to lay it right sides facing. Right side is just whichever side you want to end up being on the outside versus the inside of your leggings. And nobody's probably ever going to see it, so it doesn't really matter which one. You're just going to lay it face down like that, put a few clips in, and now we're going to take this either to your sewing machine. You can sew it with a stretch stitch, or take it to your serger and just do a 3/8 inch seam allowance just right in that small area where I have those clips. So you don't need to do the entire crotch curve, just right here. Okay, so I wanted to show you, this is the gusset seam that I just sewed, and I want to show you there's going to be a little dog ear that hangs off over the top, and that way when you turn it to the right sides, that this line up here is more even. So just make sure the seam lines line up. Okay, so now we're going to turn this out, and we're going to top stitch it. I think it makes this seam lay nice, and it makes it a little bit more secure if you top stitch it. Before I top stitch it, I'm just going to rip out a little bit of these basting stitches, the ones on this side. And when you top stitch the seam, you're going to stitch it onto the gusset. So you want the seam on the gusset. So if you're doing reverse cover stitching, you're going to want the underside, the seam side, to be facing up. But I am not doing reverse cover stitch on this pair. I'm just wanting to do the top stitch seam right here. Okay, so that seam allowance is top stitched onto the gusset. So now I'm going to treat this leg the exact same as I would the other leg. And now I'm going to sew these back seams together. So this is the side that I just added this gusset to. And now I'm going to lay the other leg right sides directly on top of this one, matching up my crotch seams. And now we're going to sew this back crotch seam and this front crotch seam. So on the back, you're just going to move this around to where the seam line meets. Now, this back is gonna have a dog ear just like the front had. I should say the back is going to have a dog ear, the back of the seam is what I mean, just like the other side of the seam did. So you'll wanna line it up like that, and then you'll just walk the edge of the fabric along here. On the gusset, it might have this blunt point right here if you didn't trim off enough of that gusset. So just make sure that you don't have a hole in your crotch. That would be awful. And that you can just trim off any extra like that. Now I'm gonna do the same thing and clip together the front. And now we're gonna go sew. I'm gonna take these to the serger and just sew this with the 3/8" seam allowance. And then after we sew it, we'll top stitch it down. Okay, so now I have sewn my back crotch and my front. I'm gonna go ahead and top stitch that just because I don't want whenever my fabric pulls apart to see any, even though my thread matches, it just makes it seem a little bit more secure. Now, if you want a decorative seam, you can do the, you'll do this side facing up. So if you want the decorative stitch there, I'm just trying to match mine and I'm not trying to do any decorative stitching. On the back, you're going to want to push the seam away from the gusset. And I'm going to remove the rest of my basting stitches. You can see as I finish top stitching the back that instead of pulling the pants away from the cover stitch, I just go right on and cover stitch and top stitch the front while they're already in the machine, and then I can pull them straight out. So the first thing I'm going to do is put my two legs right side together. You want to make sure that you've cut them as mirror images so that you have a right leg and a left leg. And I'm going to put them right sides together. Okay. And once you have them right sides together, we're going to sew our crotch seam. So to sew the crotch seam, we're going to sew our front inseam right here with a 3/8" seam allowance. And then we're going to sew... Hi. And then we're going to sew our back crotch seam with a 3/8" seam allowance using a stretch stitch. Okay, so you should have sewn these seams, and now is the time to top stitch them. And I highly recommend top stitching, especially if you didn't use thread that you would like to be seen from the right side, because as it stretches across your body, it's going to slightly show your thread. So I'm going to head to my cover stitch machine and top stitch this seam down. You can also use your twin needle. You can do a zigzag. You can use any regular stretch stitch that your sewing machine or your cover stitch has. Okay, so I'm at my cover stitch machine and I have it threaded for just 2 needles. I don't want to do a reverse cover stitch on this particular pair just because I would like it to be just like a cleaner look. I don't want all the contrast on here. I want the stripes to be what stands out as opposed to the stitching. So I'll just be doing 2 and then I'll be doing it on the right side. Just make sure that you have your seam nice and stretchy, and I like to use a leader to start off with whenever I'm cover stitching, and I'll be cover stitching from the right side. And one tip, if you're doing stripes and you notice your stripes don't match up exactly perfectly, we'll top stitch the seam towards the stripe that is ahead of the other stripe, so that if it pushes it back any slightly, it might make them match up a little better. And it's really important to top stitch if you have the wrong side of your fabric is white.
It'll help that if that seam pulls apart any, that the white isn't showing through as much. Sometimes I'll tell people, if they'll ask me, do I have to top stitch? Well, I'll tell them, no, you don't have to top stitch if your thread matches. Well, one caveat to that is if the back of your fabric is a different color, you may want to top stitch just so that the white, you have less chance of the white showing through. So I did one side, and now I'm going to do the other. Now to end a cover stitched seam, I'm going to get something to, I'm going to first pick up my presser foot and then raise my needles. And then I just get like a small device or a tool to pull my threads forward. And then you can pull it out to the side. I am super excited with the top stitching because, see, you can see how now that seam doesn't really show the underside as much. And it made my stripes match up a lot better. I was just a tiny bit off on my stripes, and then it pushed them forward just the amount I needed to make it on.